This is a history video. I am not a fascist or anything else. The purpose is to learn from history so we don't repeat it. So with that in mind, let's find out why Oswald Mosley turned to fascism. In order to understand Oswald Mosley and his conversion to fascism, we need to start our story a little bit before this time. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the people worked on farms from dawn till dusk, receiving low pay for back-breaking labour. The life expectancy of a British person was 35. In London between the years 1730 and 1749, 74.5% of children died before they reached the age of 5. That's 3/4 of all children. Imagine a world where that happened, because that world was the reality for the vast majority of human history. Centuries before the miracles of modern medicine, England was awash with parentless, sick and dying children. Farmers in places like France and Russia hibernated for 6 months of the year due to a lack of food. I don't have evidence of that happening in Britain, but I do have evidence that 1 in 10 families in England were below the breadline during the Georgian era, and people did starve to death in Britain during the pre-industrial and early industrial era. But in the late 1700s, people started to move from the farms to the cities as a result of industrialization. Now, this is not to say that there wasn't poverty in the cities. Of course there was, but the industrial jobs weren't as long-houred as the agricultural jobs, and they were better paid as well. If they weren't, then why would people have left the idyllic farms to go to the squalor cities? It doesn't make sense for them to choose the worst option. And the reason why they chose the terrible city jobs was because the farm jobs were even worse. You were basically impoverished by working on the farms, whereas you had a better chance of survival working in the factories. As a result, poverty decreased. From a child mortality rate of 74.5% in the 1730s and 40s, it was down to 31.8% in the 1810 to 1829 period. A staggering decrease in child deaths for the first time in human history. And just a note, Charles Dickens was writing during this era. Oliver Twist was published in the late 1830s. So at a time when industrialization had barely gotten going, and as urbanization was happening, Dickens was seeing all this poverty and was writing about it. And that's fair enough. 31.8% of children are still dying as late as 1829. But what is not said is that this was a vast improvement compared to what had happened earlier. In the mid-1700s, it was 74.5%, so industrialization was making life better, not worse. But Charles Dickens, like so many other early anti-poverty activists, doesn't know this. So he and others conclude that the poverty they saw was caused by industrialization and the so-called free market, when in reality poverty was decreasing because of industrialization and the free market. I know he's a fictional character, but Oliver Twist would have died had he been born in the 1700s, whereas he had a much better chance of survival because he was in the early 1800s. Despite the great success of classical liberalism in boosting wealth, living standards, lifespans, liberty, peace, education and technology faster than ever recorded in human history, its achievements were continuously scorned by wealthy adversaries with ulterior motives, and ideologues with political ends to serve. I have to at this point give a shout out to the book Killing History, The False Left-Right Political Spectrum by L.K. Samuels. It's a fantastic book, highly recommended for various reasons, and no, this isn't a sponsored video. I'm not getting commission, and I only recommend books I genuinely think are good and would be of interest to you on a given topic. Now, I have been reluctant to do this, but I hereby declare my aversion to the left and right political spectrum, and all spectrums. I've given up on the whole thing. Calling something left and right or whatever just muddies the water because the terms have been shackled with deliberate distortions that cause confusion. Therefore, it's better to abandon political spectrums altogether in favour of looking at the individual policies of a given faction and then judging them accordingly. You might disagree with this approach, but, well, these terms just aren't helping. So, with that in mind, we have all this industrialization and urbanization going on, and standards of living for the poor were slowly getting better. But there was an establishment backlash against this. In the 1840s, the Conservative Party was the pro-statist party. They stood for authority, monarchy, nationalism, high taxes, and heavy intervention in the economy. The Conservative Party exists to conserve. It is the party of the status quo. And what was the status quo back in the 1840s? Monarchy, authority, high taxation, and heavy intervention in the economy to prevent the poor from improving their standards of living. They wanted things to go back to as they had been before the Industrial Revolution. They wanted to be the lords on the manor, with the poor and starving peasants working their fields. That's why they were against change, because of what had happened in the French and Industrial Revolutions. Now, yes, technically they were opponents of other utopian political visions, but that doesn't mean that they were against all utopian visions. They wanted to protect the church and the aristocracy, who they believed were central to British society at the time. And again, they wanted a feudal-style Britain because that was their utopia, because they were the landowners. Thus, they were pro-taxation and pro-protectionism because taxation benefited the government, who were the aristocrats, and protectionism would benefit them because they owned all the farms. During the 1870s, the large-scale imports of cheap grain from North America triggered a long-term decline in agriculture, marked by falling rents and land values, which left a generation of country gentlemen and aristocratic landowners disillusioned with conventional conservatism, and was eventually to make them susceptible to extremist politics. So the conservative aristocrats were pro-state. They were statists, mercantilists, nationalists. It was the conservatives who implemented the income tax in the 1840s, because up to this point taxes had been largely indirect, and they wanted direct taxation on the industrialists who were benefiting the poor. They didn't want to get rid of the Corn Laws, which had previously been implemented to protect British agriculture by guaranteeing high food prices that had to be paid by the poor. If you want to know why people were going hungry in the 1800s, it wasn't because of evil capitalists, it was because of statist price setting, high regulation, and taxation. In other words, it was a lack of a free market, and the Conservatives weren't the industrialists. They were against the free market and the industrialists. That was who they were implementing regulations and taxation against. And by the way, the source I'm using for this is a standard history book, not someone from the Mises Institute or something. The historians are largely in agreement with what I've just said, so this shouldn't be controversial, but I know that people's perceptions of what the Conservatives are is different to what they actually are. They've just implemented higher taxes on the poor and businesses, and lower taxes on the establishment aristocracy. And last year, when Comrade Zonak got in, he raised taxes. That's why they're known as the Low Tax Party, because they always implement low taxes on the establishment and higher taxes on the rest of us. They've been consistent throughout their entire political history. Now, yes, there have been times where they lowered taxes or got rid of regulations. The political situation had changed in the 1850s because the British people were all in favour of a free market. The people understood that free markets resulted in better living standards. So Conservative leader Disraeli realised in October 1849 that the Conservative policy of protectionism was costing them votes, and thus political power, since most of the society was in favour of free trade. So they turned in favour of free trade to get elected. But that was a political ploy. They still remained the party of the establishment, the state, and remained a high tax and protectionist party. Disraeli's greatest legacy to the Conservatives was to make them the national party, From the late 1870s, the Conservatives were able to wrap themselves in the Union Jack, and when all other tactics failed, they were able to identify themselves with a strong foreign and defence policy. Whatever else changed between Disraeli and Thatcher, that at least remained the same.
Thatcher implemented the poll tax, almost doubled VAT, and it was increased again during John Major's term and again under Cameron's term in 2010. Yet, despite this, people vote for them hoping for lower taxes. No, they hate the free market and they're for higher taxation, regulation and protectionism, and they always have been. On occasion they might lower taxes to win votes or for stability reasons, but usually they raise them again or lower them against one part of the economy and higher them on another. They've never been low tax. Now, why am I bringing this up? Well, where did Mosley start his political career? The Conservative Party. Forget left and right and up and down or any of that nonsense. Look at the facts. Mosley was an aristocrat. He was Lord Mosley. He was pro-monarchy, pro-taxation, pro-regulation, pro-autarky protectionism. He was against the free market. He was against industrialists, the businessmen, and the self-employed. He thought that they all should be forced into a giant hierarchical structure led by an aristocratic type elite. That's why he started in the Conservative Party, because that's what the Conservatives have always been about. Now, he did disagree with certain policies of the Conservatives, even when he was first elected in 1918. He disagreed with the hereditary principle of the House of Lords, and he was in favour of modern reforms for the British state. He was also against aliens, in this case the Germans living in Britain, because he thought that they were reducing wages, underselling goods, ruining English social life, and also spreading disease. Okay? However, even at this point, he believed that the British state should provide welfare and education for the British people. A typical Conservative position. Why is that? Well, it's because, as we just saw before, Conservatives are the aristocratic elite. They want higher taxes for themselves, so by providing limited welfare and an education, they can impose higher taxes and pocket the rest. However, Mosley wasn't your typical Conservative. He seems to have genuinely believed that the British people should be looked after by the British state, and he disagreed with the Conservative government's policies in Ireland at the time. He questioned the use of British troops and compared their tactics to that of the Germans in Belgium during the First World War. He was branded a renegade by his fellow Conservatives, and therefore in November 1920, after 2 years in the Conservative Party, Mosley crossed the floor and became an independent. As one historian has said,
the Irish controversy signalled the start of Mosley's liberal moment.
Now, Mosley stays independent for a couple of years before siding with the Liberal Party. He doesn't become a Liberal member, but he's basically with them for a short time, so it's worth talking about the Liberals. The Liberal Party had its origins in the Whig Party, which had its origins in the 1600s, but we'll start off in the early 1800s. The Whigs were against the Conservatives. They were for free trade and property rights. They were basically the Adam Smith Party. They weren't ANCAPs by any stretch of the imagination. After all, they were an aristocratic faction, but were classical liberal in their outlook. Individual liberty was seen as something to aim for. However, there was a flaw in their reasoning. Some argued that liberty could only come about if the state intervened in the life of the people.
Liberals had no scruples about interfering with the poor, even without their consent through the vote, in the interests of improved social morality as they understood it.
They weren't entirely free market, through no fault of their own. Everyone's understanding of economics back then was primitive, as it is for a lot of people today. They were still operating under the Labour theory of value, since the subjective theory of value was only discovered in 1871. So back then, they didn't really understand what was going on. So while they freed the slaves in 1832, they implemented legislation that banned football and animal fighting, and said that it was okay to dissect the bodies of people who had died in the workhouses. They also weren't a zero-tax party. They implemented interventionist legislation, but they certainly were more hands-off than the others. Skipping over a whole complex history of various factions and infighting, the Liberal Party emerges from the Whigs, sort of, by the 1860s. But there's a problem. Poverty still existed, and people started to falsely assume that laissez-faire economics was causing this poverty. Dickens's socialist propaganda, because it was socialist propaganda, falsely blamed poverty on laissez-faire economics. But he wasn't the only one. A Hegelian called Thomas Hill Green started the ball rolling in the 1870s, followed by one of his students, a guy called Arnold Toynbee, who questioned the idea of laissez-faire economics being good for society. Toynbee especially believed that the poor were being trampled by it. Of course, he had a perfect solution.
Toynbee viewed the state as something more than a mechanical contrivance for material ends, as a union of men for the highest purposes of human nature.
I would like to point out that Green and Toynbee were Hegelians, and I think it's extremely interesting that they went to the Liberal Party to demand reform. The Conservatives were the party for the strong state, yet Green and Toynbee went to the Liberals, the laissez-faire market party. That's very strange. But anyway, because of the Hegelian attack, John Stuart Mill, who had been a classic liberal, had a crisis of confidence and basically turned into a socialist as a result. He wasn't a Marxist, he became a classic utopian socialist, believing that private property and money should still exist, but that society should help the less fortunate, because he now believed that freedom for the individual could only occur under the guiding hand of the state. So the old classic liberalism of laissez-faire economics was under attack, and the Liberals began to think that they should intervene in the more extreme cases of poverty, or when it was deemed that the free market had failed. In the 1880s and 1890s, Rowntree and Booth published studies on poverty and basically confirmed to everyone that laissez-faire was anything but fair. Now, I want to make it clear that the free market wasn't causing this poverty, the free market was pulling people out of poverty during this period. Between 1870 and 1914, the amount of food consumed by the British people skyrocketed.
All departments of life showed improvements. People ate and dressed better. Many items once considered luxuries now were being mass-produced. Furniture, books, pictures, carpets, cigarettes, pianos, watches, neckties, and roller skates entered general circulation. Similarly, entertainment became universally accessible. Annual consumption of goods increased markedly. Consumption of sugar rose from £12 per person in 1870 to £34 in 1907. That of beer from 78 litres in 1872 to 123 litres in 1900. In 1873, average annual consumption of meat was about £59 per person. That had gone up to £105 in 1912.
The guys back in the 1800s should have known this. Yes, they didn't have the statistics that we do now, but one of Karl Marx and Engels' disciples, Erdard Bernstein, who was one of the people who buried Engels at sea, could tell with his own eyes that the poor were getting richer as a result of laissez-faire. He began to deviate from Marx in the early 1890s and started publishing literature against Marx's ideology. So if he could see it, why couldn't any of the laissez-faire guys? But regardless, as a result of the crisis of confidence brought on by the Hegelians, a radical faction emerged and eventually took over the Liberal Party. By 1890, old liberalism had died and new liberalism was cast to the side, although it wouldn't die completely until about 1911. New liberalism effectively abandoned laissez-faire and free market economics and was decisively more interventionist, almost socialist.
In order to differentiate the two, the liberalism of the 17th and 19th centuries has been dubbed classic liberalism, also called laissez-faire liberalism, while the more contemporary version has been labelled modern liberalism, social liberalism, or nanny-state liberalism.
The so-called New Liberals then went on to implement policies like state pensions, school reform, and so on. Nothing dramatic compared to what came later, but enough for historians to note the significance, and also the change in tactics.
By 1890, the socialists seemed to pose a serious threat in the possible creation of an independent working class party. Progressive liberals responded to these socialist threats by advocating lib-lab cooperation and by supporting working class and industrial reform. In one sense then, the change from the old to the new radicalism lay in the new orientation towards socialist reforms. And indeed, the border between the left wing of liberalism and the right wing of the socialist groups was so indistinct that it depends mainly on point of view whether some individuals are classed as radicals or socialists. They favoured the same practical reforms.
The Fabian society is also involved here, and the fact that the Hegelians were there as well, I don't know, my spidey senses are tingling. The fact that they went for the classic liberals and not the conservatives really strikes me as suspicious. And the fact that the liberals folded so easily just doesn't make sense, especially since the vast majority of the British public were still laissez-faire advocates. Up until the late 1880s, the workers and their bosses, the so-called capitalists, were on the same team. Yes, there was a union movement, but it wasn't until 1889 that the two sides started to clash. Again, really suspicious in my opinion.
The major basis of liberal support came from an alliance between the middle class and the working class. This alliance was made possible because working class voters generally shared middle class goals and middle class assumptions about the nature of the economy and of politics. The great bulk of the working class in the 1860s and 70s was still pre-industrial in the modern sense. The typical workman was a craftsman or a small-scale capitalist. In the economic world of these small-scale producers, it was still possible to rise by thrift and self-help. These working-class voters, therefore, shared the middle-class ideal of individualism, and as small-scale producers, they did not see the capitalist as their class enemy. Until the end of the 1880s then, the leaders of organised labour had no desire to use politics for economic ends. So wait, there's no antagonism between the workers and their employers throughout most of the Industrial Revolution, until the late 1880s, which just so happens to be when the laissez-faire Liberal Party abandoned their free market economics. Let me just read that first line again. The major basis of liberal support came from an alliance between the middle class and the working class.
So you're saying that in the middle of a century where the aristocratic elite were losing power to a free population that was pulling itself out of poverty for the first time in human history off the back of free market economics, there just so happened to be a Gnostic cult attack upon the very principles that were enriching the entire population at the expense of the power of the elite. And then, after a century of progress, an artificial split was created between the employers and employees, dividing the very alliance that had weakened the elite and strengthened the poor and middle-income earners. And as a result of that split, it turned the entire political landscape into a pro-authoritarian, pro-taxation, pro-regulation, pro-reform and pro-inflation cesspool. All policies designed to hurt both the employer and employee and keep them divided as the aristocratic elite get richer and richer and we all end up back in feudal times eating bugs and being happy. I'm sure this is all just a coincidence, right? Now, we've been played. This is all a trick. If you get rid of the left and right nonsense and forget party politics for a moment, they're all the same. Pick a party. They're all pro-state. They're all pro-establishment. They're all pro-tax. They're all on the same side. When they get in, nothing ever changes. Yeah, we've been played. Employers and employees have been divided. Why? Patriarchy, fat versus thin, a million genders and races, class warfare. We've been played. They're keeping us divided. And they're keeping us against the free market and liberty. Socialists are just puppets of the elite. You know, let's start at the top, go around. That's one revolution. Nothing ever happens. Nothing ever changes. The elites stay in power. It just goes round in circles. It's a Gnostic snake eating its own tail. It's a con game, and we've all been conned. The establishment always wins. The revolution benefits them. It keeps them in power. But going back to Mosley, we can see now why he sided with the Liberals. He was hoping to tackle the economic and social issues of the time. He was described as a de facto Liberal, and Asquith, the leader of the Liberals, regarded him as a member of his party. There's also evidence that he was anti-war throughout this period, not just later. He was against the Ruhr crisis, against involvement in Mesopotamia, and said that war in Europe shouldn't be repeated.
The follies of Europe have been cleansed sufficiently in the blood of our people, and never again will they contemplate or will they tolerate military intervention from this country in the internal affairs of the continent. It is better to be in isolation than in sheer desolation. If the worst comes to the worst, this country may once again have to turn away from Europe towards the New World, and ultimately call in the New World to redress the balance of the Old.
On economics, Mosley was, even at this time, presenting a very Keynesian approach to the problem of unemployment. He called for the stabilisation of the international exchange as a way to tackle unemployment. This isn't a coincidence because he had started to study economic theory via the writings of Lord Byron Keynes. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the aristocratic Keynes was criticising the free market capitalist system, which he called a double bluff or deception, and advocating for inflation and the destruction of the free market money. Since unemployment was the major issue at this point, Mosley got re-elected as an independent in 1923, but he was moving closer to the Labour Party, who were now taking an interest in him. For the first time, the Labour Party became the second largest party after the decline of the Liberals to third place, and in January 1924, a minority Labour government, the first ever, took office under Ramsay MacDonald. Mosley realised that the tide had turned and that his policies weren't much different to that of the Labour policies, so he joined the Labour Party in March 1924.
He ran against Neville Chamberlain in the 1924 election, and with an 80.5% turnout, Neville won with 49.1% of the vote. Mosley came in second with 48.9%, with the Liberal candidate receiving 2%. This was a loss, but a huge blow to Chamberlain, and Mosley's campaign had caused the second highest turnout in the country. Labour ended up losing the election anyway, but the Liberal Party was all but destroyed, losing 118 seats and leaving them with 40. So Mosley moving over to Labour was the correct choice, even though he lost against Chamberlain by 77 votes.
The Labour Party, which had been founded in 1900, was, and still is, the Socialist Party of the UK. And so, at the by-election of December 1926, when Mosley ran again, he was attacked by the Conservatives for being rich. You know, he can't be for the poor workers when he's a rich aristocrat. It shows the hypocrisy, even though every Labour Party politician is rich, we'll just ignore that. However, being in the middle of a severe winter where there was a coal crisis brought on by a miners' strike, the people voted for the Labour candidate anyway. It makes no sense why they would vote for a so-called worker party that was designed to convince the workers not to work and make them cold, but that's beside the point. Mosley won, although his performance wasn't anything atypical for Labour at this time. However, what is important is that because Mosley entered the Labour Party, he also ended up becoming a committed member of the Fabian Society in the 1920s and 30s. You won't find that fact on Wikipedia. Samuels delivers the goods once again. And Mosley ended up having to deal with the trade unions who were allied to the Labour Party. Mosley had never dealt with them before 1924 and was now getting stuck into their debates and strikes. Bearing in mind that the Labour Party was also full of communists.
A handful proclaimed their admiration of the Soviet Union. 3 banners included images of Lenin, in one case accompanied by Marx and, rather incongruously, MacDonald.
The workers were so poor that they had the money for these banners. And what's interesting about this is that when the miners went on strike in 1926, they were demanding better pay, better working conditions, and less working hours. However, the mines they were demanding these things from were unprofitable. So how could the employers give them better pay and allow them to work less hours if they didn't have the money to do that? Mosley's response was to publish an essay titled Revolution by Reason, saying that the banking sector should be socialised, allowing it to expand consumer credit to the poor. Because obviously, the solution to low pay and poverty is to get the poor in debt. Mosley also talked about the international financiers in his Revolution by Reason and used racist terminology, which the historian Howell, in his really in-depth book on Mosley's early years, says was commonplace at the time. This is true, but once again it shows that racism is fine when it's in the Labour Party and not fine when it's outside the Labour Party. Mosley later went on to say that the socialisation of the banks would be used to create a minimum wage for the workers, perhaps unaware that minimum wage creates mass long-term unemployment. So not only would the state and the poor be massively in debt, they'd be split in two, with some benefiting from the system and most not doing.
Low-skilled workers who would be employable at a low wage become unemployable at an artificially higher wage, and that explains the perverse cruelty of minimum wage laws. It inflicts the greatest harm on the very workers it is allegedly designed to help.
Nonetheless, the Labour Party in Birmingham adopted Mosley's proposals, and later he was given the task of addressing the problem of unemployment when he entered the cabinet of the Labour government in 1929. For context, unemployment rose from 1.1 million in 1929 to 2.5 million in 1930, which was 16% of the British labour force. So something had to be done. Well, Mosley ended up at loggerheads with the Lord Privy Seal, Jimmy Thomas, who was a labour trade unionist, also in charge of solving the unemployment problem. Mosley proposed several measures, from early old age pensions designed to free up jobs for the young, and a public works programme designed to revive the economy and get people back to work. These were rejected due to expense, with Thomas and the government favouring cost-cutting measures and an unemployment insurance bill. Many labour and trade unionists were disappointed, with Mosley accusing the Labour Party of just taking a conservative stance on the issue. He therefore wrote what is now known as the Mosley Memorandum, trying to solve the issue of unemployment through bank loans to fund job creation, plus other measures. He sent a copy to Keynes, who responded in favour of what Mosley had proposed, which is interesting considering that historians like Pugh and Taylor do their utmost to ignore the Keynes and Mosley connection by not mentioning Keynes at all. Taylor even says this:
Mosley's proposals were more creative than those of Lloyd George, and offered a blueprint for most of the constructive advances in economic policy to the present day. It is impossible to say where Mosley got his ideas from. Perhaps he devised them himself. No, he got them from Lord Baron Keynes. You just don't want to associate Keynes with fascism. If so, they were an astonishing achievement, evidence of a superlative talent which was later to be wasted. Just get a room, will you? But here's why I've brought this quote up. Mosley was offering a radical economic policy, more radical than the Labour or Liberal parties could offer, and they rejected it.
The Labour government considered Mosley's policies and then dismissed them with a vote of 202 against to 29 for Mosley. They said that unrestricted debt spending would be unpopular with the public wanting security, not insecurity, and would hand the Conservatives a win at the next election. Despite MacDonald suggesting that he should stay on, Mosley resigned on the 20th of May 1930, the first minister ever to resign from a Labour government.
The crisis demanded a war footing, a revolution in administrative procedure. His conception of a machine for a vast programme contrasted with the more restrained criticisms of other Labour Party members.
Yes, Mosley wanted a revolutionary war economy which he described as a machine. And what he had proposed was typical of a Labour supporter. The government is the one that creates jobs, right? But for whatever reason, the Labour government did not want to deliver on its promises. It didn't want to attempt to solve the economic issues by implementing socialism.
The Labour Party possessed a utopian ethic of socialism, but it failed to develop the pragmatic programme either to alter the capitalist state which it inherited or to reform it from within.
Not that socialism would have worked, it never does, but if you're the socialist, you should at least attempt to do what you claim to do. But they didn't. Well, Mosley adapted the principles of the Mosley Memorandum, which was rewritten and became known as the Mosley Manifesto. Keynes was highly in favour of it, but he didn't have any influence on the Labour Party at this moment. Nonetheless, Mosley and 6 other Labour MPs left the Labour Party to form a new party called the New Party. One Ulster Unionist, William Edward David Allen, also joined them, but historians are split on whether to call Allen a conservative or not. Regardless, they were mostly socialists who were sick of the current party system and didn't see the Labour Party as good enough. In contrast to the other parties, they now campaigned on action, because they thought the other parties were just talking and weren't actually doing anything. In fact, the new party's journal was called Action. Unfortunately, Mosley was ill, so the campaign didn't go so well. But what's interesting is that the socialists violently attacked Mosley's new party during the by-election at Ashton-under-Lyne in 1931, which the new party won.
The by-election provoked a bitter display of tribalism on the Labour side. Instead of blaming the defeat on its own leaders, the movement turned its anger against Mosley. Damned as a traitor and a Judas, he was subjected to physical attack throughout the campaign. On the steps of Ashton Town Hall, where he was buffeted by Labour supporters after the declaration, Mosley remarked bitterly to Strachey, "That is the crowd that has prevented anyone from doing anything in England since the war."
Mosley's not a fascist at this point, but Mosley learned what I learned and what so many others have learned as well. You're not allowed to abandon socialism or the left. You're not allowed to have an independent thought or offer criticism to them. As soon as you do, you'll come under attack. Mosley didn't provoke the left attacked him first, before he was even a fascist. He didn't have his bodyguards yet or anything like that. In fact, it was the Labour violence that caused him to employ security forces.
The violent attacks to which the new party was subjected by left-wing groups accelerated the evolution of Mosley's political strategy. Well aware that the Conservatives employed fascist stewards to police their meetings, he quickly concluded that the new party would have to provide its own.
So all stewards are fascist now, apparently? But the point is that Mosley reacted to political violence with political violence. However, the historians only paint Mosley as violent, not his political opponents. Bias much? And I'm not trying to defend any side here because they're all pro-establishment anyway, but my concern is with the double standards which historians have employed. When the fascists do something, it's violence. But when the pro-establishment forces do something, it's mostly peaceful protests. Seriously, they need to start being consistent. Under threat of political violence, Mosley decided to recruit a trained body of stewards to keep his party protected. These were trained by Edward Kid Lewis, a Jewish boxer. And in fact, that Pew fails to mention. When Mosley spoke at Glasgow, 500 communists attacked him and this new bodyguard with stones and razors. So again, there's no justification for this. Mosley wasn't a fascist at this point. The boxer who trained the bodyguards was Jewish, and Mosley's policies were entirely in alignment with Keynes and the left, for want of a better word. Who was being more violent?
Violence aside, the new party were crushed in the 1931 general election. not a single member got elected. And to be fair, the Labour Party was crushed as well. They lost 78% of their seats because everyone had lost confidence in them. The Conservatives won 470 seats, a huge majority, and formed a national government with others, creating a 554-seat strong government.
So let's just think about this. The Labour Party was in power during the beginning years of the Great Depression. It failed to solve the crisis and was subsequently destroyed in the general election. Mosley then turns to fascism, which we'll get to in a second. But what would you conclude from this? Would you conclude something like the Labour Party was insufficient or inactive? Would you conclude that the Labour Party's inactivity meant that Mosley had to seek an alternative route? Because that's not what the historians think.
British fascism was born of the failure of economic conservatism to check the rapid decline of Britain in the interwar years.
Okay, there's several things wrong with this statement. Economic conservatism wasn't laissez-faire free markets, even though people think it is, and this author doesn't clarify that, giving a false impression of what was really happening here. Secondly, it wasn't conservatism that was in power. The Labour Party was the one that failed, so the British public turned to the Conservatives in the hope that they would free up the market, which they didn't do, because again, the Conservatives were never laissez-faire, even though people think they are. It was the Labour Party's economics that failed. The Labour Party had implemented things like the Coal Mines Act of 1930, where they introduced quotas for production. They guaranteed a minimum price for coal, not maximum, minimum, meaning they made it more expensive, and then reduced the workday from 8 hours to 7.5. What did that all do? It increased the price of coal during the Great Depression.
The Coal Mines Act of 1930 was their most important domestic achievement and a landmark in British history. The Act protected the inefficient coal mines. It operated restriction and stable prices at the expense of the consumer. Here was the pattern for British capitalism in the 30s.
Oh yes, because Labour introduced capitalism to Britain, because they're not real socialists. Clearly A.G.P. Taylor is incorrect in his assessment of whether this was capitalism or not, but the point is that the consumer was getting hurt by the higher prices that were forced upon them by the Labour Party. They also introduced an Agricultural Marketing Act in 1931, which created boards for government bureaucrats to fix prices again, hurting the consumer once more. And what did MacDonald do? What did he blame?
We are not on trial. It is the system under which we live. It has broken down everywhere, as it was bound to break down.
Oh, I see. We've got to blame it on capitalism and economic conservatism, which we're going to assume is capitalism even though it's not, despite the fact that the Labour Party was the one in power, and it was them who were implementing socialist policies. You know, the Labour Party guy said so we've just got to believe him. And all the historians did just that. You know, is anyone else thinking that these historians are a little bit Hegelian in their assessment? Or is it just me? But yeah, Labour and Mosley's new party got defeated, as the British people voted for the Conservatives. Mosley could have just stayed within the system. He could have gone back cap in hand to the Labour, Liberal or Conservative parties. But he wasn't impressed by their lack of action. Labour weren't willing to do anything and had been crushed. Plus, they were violently hostile to him anyway, and the Liberals were basically dead at this point. Plus,
Baldwin's Conservative Party had emerged apparently as the party for all anti-socialists. The Conservative Party was increasingly dismissed by Mosley as unimaginative and reactionary.
This is important because a lot of the historians say that Mosley was a reactionary conservative. But even by their own standards, he wasn't. He could have rejoined the Conservative Party at this point, and a political opportunist would have done just that, since the Conservatives had just won one of the greatest landslides in history. But he didn't do that because to him, they were reactionaries. Despite this, historians like Thurlow state over and over again that Mosley and fascism was a conservative and reactionary movement. Now, In the way that he's using these words, he's wrong. But he is correct for the wrong reasons. Fascism is a conservative movement, just like socialism is a conservative movement as well. They're all pro-state, pro-elite, pro-tax, pro-regulation and pro-inflation. None of them are for actual progress. They're all for locking down the economy to save the granny state rather than freeing the market. Who locked down the entire world for 2.5 years? They all did. Doesn't matter who was elected, they all marched in goose step. So in this sense, yes, they are ultra-conservative reactionary fascism, which is what Thurlow calls it at one point, but he's using it in the wrong sense. You know, far left and far right, Marxist, fascist, socialist, conservative, ultra this, radical that, it's all the same. So Mosley ends 1931 as a political outcast. He has no party, it has been dissolved, and he can't bring himself to go back to the old gangs as he called them. So he starts to study the non-mainstream parties, which leads him to go see Mussolini in 1932. But I want to make this clear, until this moment there's no way that you can call Mosley a fascist. He was beginning to consider the fascist idea in late 1931, but he hadn't yet converted. And I'm not the only one to say that.
Mosley's political career until the brief and troubled life of the new party can be explored and analysed without any significant reference to fascism or to any alleged burgeoning sympathy for fascist doctrines.
But in the aftermath of the defeat, he turned to fascism. There's several reasons why he does this, but the main reason why is because the other parties had failed. They were not radical enough to implement the revolutionary economic and social policies that Mosley thought could save Britain and improve the welfare of the British people. He only saw two factions that he could join.
Communism will quickly supersede the woolly-headed and woolly-hearted Social Democrats of Labour, and communism's inevitable and historic opponent will arise to take the place of a flabby conservatism.
Mosley went to Italy to see Mussolini in the January of 1932, who warned him not to attempt a military coup in Britain. And Mosley had effectively converted to fascism. In the summer of 1932, he wrote a book called The Greater Britain, which basically became the new manifesto of the fascist party he was about to create. That party wouldn't be created until the October, but nonetheless, The Greater Britain spells out exactly what he was thinking.
In the ranks of conservatism, there are many who are attracted there by the party's tradition of loyalty, order and stability, but who are nonetheless repelled by its lethargy and stagnation. In the ranks of Labour, there are many who follow the party's humane ideals and are attracted by its vital urge to remedy social and economic evils, but who are, nonetheless, repelled by its endless and inconclusive debates, its cowardice, its lack of leadership and decision. These elements comprise the best of both parties, and to both fascism appeals. The two essentials of government are stability and progress, and the tragedy of politics is that the two, essentially coincident, are organised as contradictions. Stability implies order and authority, without which nothing can be done. It is regarded as belonging to the right. Progress implies the urge to reform, without which society cannot survive. It is regarded as belonging to the left. Stability is confused with reaction and a stamp-pat resistance to change. Progress with ill-considered changes, or with the futile and paralytic discussions so characteristic of a timorous democracy. This is a dynamic age. Stability cannot exist without progress, for it implies the recognition of changes in the world which no political system can alter. Nor can progress exist without stability, for it implies a balanced and orderly view of the changes which have taken place. The right seeks stability, but denies the power of adaptation, which makes stability an active force. The left seeks progress, but rejects all effective instruments and robs authority of the power to make decisions. The result of both systems, of the two great organised parties of the state, is, in the end, the same. Stability confused with reaction and resistance to change, together with progress confused with obstructive debate and committee irresponsibility, end alike in chaos. Both are instruments for preventing things being done, and the first requisite of the modern age is that things should be done. Both political parties, and the remnants of liberalism as well, stand bound by the great vested interests of right and left which created them. In opposition, there is the same profusion of promise. In office, the same apathy and inertia. In post-war England, their creeds have become platitudes. They consistently fail to grapple with the problems of the time. Their rule has led with tragic inevitability to the present chaos. Therefore, our fascist movement seeks on the one hand stability, which envisions order and authority as the basis of all solid achievement. We seek, on the other hand, progress, which can be achieved only by the executive instrument that order, authority, and decision alone can give. The main object of the modern and fascist movement is the establishment of the corporate state. In our belief, it is the greatest constructive conception yet devised by the mind of man. In psychology, it is based on teamwork. In organisation, it is the rationalised state. It is this machinery of central direction which the corporate state is designed to supply. This does not mean control from Whitehall or constant interference by government with the business of industry, but it does mean that government, or rather the corporate system, will lay down the limits within which individuals and interests may operate. Those limits are the welfare of the nation, not, which all is said, a very unreasonable criterion. Within these limits, all activity is encouraged. Individual enterprise and the making of profit are not only permitted, but encouraged, so long as that enterprise enriches rather than damages by its activity the nation as a whole. But so soon as anybody, whether an individual or an organised interest, steps outside those limits so that his activity becomes sectional and anti-social, the mechanism of the corporate system descends upon him. This implies that every interest, whether right or left, industrial, financial, trade union or banking system, is subordinated to the welfare of the community as a whole and to the overriding authority of the organised state. No state within the state can be permitted. All within the state, none outside the state, none against the state. And here he's quoting Mussolini's speech in Milan, 28th of October 1925.
Mosley was fed up with the current system. He wanted to get things done, and those things required a totalitarian state that could centrally organise the society and economy to better help the welfare of the people. Yes, profit is mentioned, and he claims that there will be individual enterprise, but he's not talking about a free market. This isn't laissez-faire, and if you read the rest of the book, you'll see that. But he's mentioning profit and enterprise because he's aware of his audience. The British people wanted laissez-faire. They voted for the Conservatives for a reason. They mistakenly believed that they were the low-tax and laissez-faire party, much like people still think this today. So he's addressing his audience and saying, yeah, don't worry, you can still have profit, but in reality, it's nowhere near that. Now, we'll come to look at Mosley's policies in more detail at a later date, but what can we conclude today? Well, it's clear that Mosley was a radical whose only criticism of the current system was that it wasn't doing enough. The Conservatives never wanted to help the people anyway. The Liberals were destroyed by the Hegelians, and Labour were all bark and no bite. So Mosley wanted to actually implement policies that he believed would help the British people. Now, they wouldn't help the British people because they were typical statist policies that always result in economic ruin, but he believed that they would, as many do to this day. However, his evolution through the political system, trying out every party, wasn't because he was a flip-flopper or an opportunist. It wasn't because he had no principles or was always a secret fascist. It's because he was fed up with the old system. He even says that the political and economic system is old and that there's a need for a new movement. He then presents fascism as the modern movement, which is false because it's anything but modern. You know, what policies do they have? Pro-tax, pro-inflation, pro-authority, pro-protectionism. all the traits that every other party advocated as well. Since the collapse of old liberalism in the late 1800s, all the parties had the same policies. These were the exact policies the establishment wanted. Yes, there were differences in the methods. Mosley wanted syndicalism, which arguably the Conservatives don't want, and there's an anti-communist bias, which Labour doesn't want either, but otherwise their policies are all aiming in the same direction. The methods were different, but the madness was the same. The only other major conclusion worth coming to is that the historians have not approached this with a critical eye. In some cases, they've ignored the evidence and then attached a bunch of adjectives to the word conservative in the hope that nobody would notice. My question is, why can't they come at this from anything other than an establishment perspective? There's also a question about the Fabians and the Hegelians. They did exist and they were influential, but again, are ignored by the mainstream. So there's a lot still left to look into, and I'm sure this video will cause some controversy, so I look forward to the debate. In the meantime, here's a bunch of videos you might also find interesting. Thanks for watching, bye for now.